Going once, going twice. Okay, so we stay on. Thank you. Okay, so as I don't have our text in front of us, but of course the purpose of Spiritual Roundtable is to present ideas of interest which can lead to fruitful conversation. We want to always be respectful. Our goal is not to change people's minds, but to understand other minds, including our own. And this particular topic is, in a sense, directly related to that. I remember when I was asked to do this slot, I didn't have any topic, but since then, I'm going to be doing a whole series on the Bible, and I thought, well, this would be a nice kickoff for it. So I'll go ahead and do a screen share here. Let me see if I can do full screen. There we go. Okay, so my topic for today, I pulled this title from one of my favorite books, An Inconvenient Text, How the Bible Resists Domestication and Why This is a Good Thing. So as most of you know, I study the Bible professionally, I teach about it, I write about it, and so I'm always interested in how it functions like a kind of a cultural artifact. If anyone's ever seen that movie with Denzel Washington, The Book of Eli, it's this sort of Mad Max post-apocalypse world in which Denzel Washington owns the last copy of the Bible, and the bad guys are trying to get it because they want to use it as this sort of symbol or icon of power, even though they don't know what's in it. Whereas Denzel Washington's character, he is in fact blind, and the Bible is in fact in Braille. So when the bad guys finally get a hold of it, they have this symbol of power, but they can't read it. Whereas he who has lost the text has the contents in his mind, is able to repeat it to someone. So it's interesting how we use books as symbols as well as sort of a delivery technology for information. Okay, so my goal here is to look at how people use the Bible and how it sort of pushes back against being used. And the goal is to sort of lead to some interesting observations about things we might not think about when we think about the Bible. So the first thing is that the Bible is not a book. And of course, that might seem counterintuitive because it looks like a book, right? It has two covers and has a lot of pages in between. But of course, book, in that sense, is simply a technology. A book is a way of storing information, just like a flash drive. And the book, what we call the book, which is called a codex, literally, this is a technology that did not exist at the time when the contents of the Bible were composed and gathered together. It was gathered together in scrolls, basically. So when you think about a book, it gives the illusion of unity because it's all between two covers. But if you're thinking about a room full of scrolls, well, those are all separate things, and it's really the emphasis on the person using them to decide how they're to be arranged and how they're to be read and all that. But there's a simpler way in which the Bible is not a book, because it's a library. It's a lot of books, right? Even the term Bible itself, it comes from the Greek biblia. And if you know any Romance languages like French or Spanish, you know that a biblioteca is where you put your books, right? So it's a library. It's not one thing, but many things. And so one way you can think about the Bible as an inconvenient text that pushes back against people who try to use it in a certain way is, how would you try to use a library? What are the characteristics of a library? So I came up with a couple that might be relevant to this. So a library contains different kinds of books. So even though we have the illusion of something between two covers, it contains different kinds of books in it. Also, a library contains books that present different viewpoints on a topic. And this is very true of the Bible. This is the problem I have with people who use the term biblical, the adjective, to mean some singular idea. That in fact, in the library, there are a lot of ideas about any particular topic. The third point is that authors write books for people, not for land. Here we go. Okay, so we're thinking about the Bible as a library. So it has different kinds of books. There's different viewpoints on the same topics, and authors write books for people, not for libraries. So when we think about why is a book in the Bible, it's not because someone woke up one day and said, I want to get my book in the Bible. If anyone's ever seen Andrew Lloyd Webber's Jesus Christ Superstar, where it's the musical, there's a scene where the followers of Jesus are singing a song. They're saying, I always wanted to be an apostle, knew that I could make it if I tried, and then when we retire, we can write the gospel so they'll all talk about us when we die. So there's this sort of idea that we're writing knowing that this is going to be part of some collection that's going to be important. But of course, that's not the case. No, almost no book that is in the Bible was written to be in the Bible. It was written for whatever reason people write books. And a fourth point, librarians include books that have been written for someone else other than themselves. Right? Very few people write books for librarians, and those books tend not to be read too much except by librarians. So when we think about the reasons that people put things in a library, decide to put them in, they're not just thinking about, they're not the target audience, right? So there's always a disconnect or a gap between the people who are putting together a library and why the books are written. And then finally, to understand why a book is written and why it is included in the library are therefore different questions. So we could talk about why the Bible has the books that are in it, but that's a different question about why they were written. So with all those questions in mind, or all those points in mind, I want to make one more observation. Let's see, this is not going forward. Let me see if I can make it go forward. There we go. So who are the librarians? So it depends on which Bible we're talking about, obviously. There's the Jewish Bible, and that library was composed by a bunch of rabbis, teachers, people who read the Bible a lot, around about the 2nd century AD. Then for the Christian Bible, it sort of comes into its own around the 4th century AD with bishops putting things together. So when we think about the viewpoints that are represented in the Bible, we have to remember these three things at the bottom, that the authors who wrote these things lived, wrote, and died centuries before a library existed. They had no idea that one day their writing would become part of someone else's library, and they had no idea that their viewpoints would be read alongside other viewpoints. Right? So usually an author expresses his or her own viewpoint or something, and maybe even in disagreement with someone else, and they had no idea that their work would be set alongside someone else's work, with maybe they disagreed with it, but of course they would be long dead by that time. Okay, so those are just some starting points. So the next question is, why do the rabbis or the bishops, or why did the people who compose the library, why would the librarians, why did they choose certain books and not other books? And it's a complicated question, but there's two basic reasons. One, because of the content. Right, because it's something that it interests them, or because it conforms with their worldview. You probably wouldn't include in your library something that you thought was opposed to your worldview, at least when we're talking about a religious library. But also, things get in there because they're used. So whatever criteria the people making these decisions had, often things got in there just because people used them. And when you think about how religious communities function, usually they use these here's a question. In what contexts do people use the Bible? In what context do people in a religious context use the Bible? So when is the Bible read in a religious tradition? Some of us probably grew up in a religious tradition. When did you hear the Bible read?
Well, we used to read it together.
Okay.
Take turns reading it.
So there'd be community context, like worship services and things like that, where people would read and comment on things. Also, people often read the Bible devotionally. That is, say they read it individually in order to somehow apply it to themselves individually. There might also be people who are using it in order to try to explain a particular belief that that faith community has, or trying to justify it, or reject some other belief. So it's used for various purposes. Whatever it was used, what was used by the community in question, that became part of its Bible. There wasn't necessarily a committee meeting at some point where they said, let's decide what to have in here. It was already being used. These books were already being used. So in other words, when we think about how do we explain what's in it, well, there probably is some sort of deliberation going on at some level, but there's also just the fact that things are already being used. And so it's a complicated question why things are in there. Okay, so here's a picture of one community's Bible. This is the Jewish Bible. We call Bibles canons, by the way, not like artillery, but with one N. A canon is a list of books. So on the analogy of a library, a canon is a card catalog, or what used to be called a card catalog. Right now we have digital, catalogs and such. So, here comes someone. Admit. Yeah. So when we talk about the Bible, the Jewish Bible has certain books in it, and it's organized in a certain way. In the Jewish faith, it's called the Tanakh, which is just an abbreviation for the three parts of it: Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. The Christian Bible, often called the Old Testament, has more books in it than the Jewish Bible. And depending on which flavor of Christianity you're talking about, whether you're talking about Eastern Christianity or Western Christianity, Catholic or Protestant, you're going to have a different list of books. Most of them will be all the same. Those are like the books in black here, but some of them are not. Also notice that whereas the Jewish canon has three parts to it, it's organized into three buckets, as it were. The Christian canon is organized into four buckets. Right? So think again back to this idea that when these books were written, there was no such thing as a codex. There was no such thing as two covers with things between them. Instead, you had scrolls. And so the question was, how does a community organize and categorize these literature that it reads? So it's not just how many categories, but also look at the order in which they come in. They're named a bit differently, but here's one that they have in common called the prophets. Notice that in the Jewish canon, the prophets are the middle category. In the Christian canon, they're the last category, kind of partly covered by our cameos here. So communities not only decide what to include and how to arrange them, but also there's probably a rationale behind how they're arranged. For example, in the Jewish canon, the conclusion of the Bible has to do with a passage in which the Jewish community, which is in exile from its homeland, is invited to return. So the entire kind of sequence, if you read it as a narrative, the library as a narrative, it starts with creation. It talks about the origin of the Jewish people, how they lose their land, and how they get it back. It's kind of this cyclical narrative. Whereas for Christians, they're very much interested in connecting this story with their own story, right? And the prophets are the way that they do that. So they put the prophets last, and then they get a New Testament, right? So there's no natural order in which things are put. It's the decision of a community, basically, or the usage of a community. Okay, so that's just a little background of what we mean by the Bible as a library. Why is it an inconvenient text? That's my theme. It's an inconvenient text because although communities or individuals use it for various purposes, the original intent or emphasis of a text in that Bible might differ from the way that the community or the individual canonizing it wants it to be used. And of text, the fact that you can go to a bookstore or you can go to Amazon, you can buy a text, it detaches the act of reading from a community's claims to have interpretive authority over it. And so this is, again, one way in which the practice of reading changes over time, and how the practice of the technology of using texts to communicate ideas becomes detached from the communities that created them. So as soon as you do that, well, if reading for you means sitting down and reading a set of words and deciding why they're important or what they mean or whether you agree with them or not, then you've detached that from the reason those texts came into existence as a library in the first place. Then there's a final reason why texts can push back against the communities that canonize them. First, because all texts contain a surplus of meaning. There's always more meaning to be found in any piece of writing. That's the nature of language. But it's not like it's a free-for-all, because texts also carry traces of the intent of their authors, right? Not the intent of the communities that put them in their libraries. They contain traces of why they were written in the first place. And these can be ignored or suppressed, but you can't totally erase them without erasing the text itself. And so there's the paradox, is that these libraries, they're used by religious communities for a variety of purposes, but those purposes aren't always the same as the reason they were written for. There's going to be some harmony between what's in those texts and what a community uses them for, otherwise they wouldn't be in there. But at the same time, there's that gap. And why an author writes a text, again, may be different from why a person reads a text. Okay, so this is all just kind of theoretical background. So why is this a good thing? First, because every act of reading is an opportunity for two human beings, one who is present and the other absent, to encounter each other. Right? This is part of what being human is we encounter other people, or we encounter their ideas, and that dialogue, that interaction, is part of what makes us who we are. So it's a good thing that texts can say different things different from what we want them to. Secondly, because when the writer is long dead, reading is also an opportunity to stretch our human experience to connect with that person's experience. So it's sort of a dialogue with the dead, but it's also, we link our own present with the past experience of being human. And then finally, while we can use a text for our own purposes, we can also encounter and discover in it something other than ourselves. Right? The great spiritual problem is that we want to be the center of the universe, right? We want everything to be about ourselves, and that's a kind of narcissism, right? So when we try to attend to a text as an expression of another human being's experience and not simply projecting onto it our own, we learn something. We learn something about ourselves. We become we develop humility. We develop an ability to understand, right? So all these are good things. Okay, so I want to give 5 examples of how the Bible can be helpfully inconvenient in these ways. And for each of these, I'm going to stop and invite comment from you, kind of invite reactions. So these are sort of my top 5 ways in which the Bible can be interestingly inconvenient. And here's how I would summarize them. The first is what I call skepticism. So often people associate religion with dogmatism, with kind of suppression of critical thinking, all that kind of stuff. The Bible certainly contains texts that can be used to support that mentality, but it also contains texts that criticize it. There's a genuine skepticism within the Bible about religion, among other things. The second way it can be inconvenient, in this good way, is that ideas that become central to a religion or a people's worldview can be subverted by these texts. Subverted in the sense of your view of things is inadequate, you don't have a full view, I'm going to give you an alternative view, and it's going to challenge those basic ideas. So we tend to think of the Bible as just some uniform document that supports the people who use it, but actually there are things within it that subvert or undermine or critique a lot of assumptions. And in that sense, it goes along with skepticism. The third example has to do with open-ended questions. There's these billboards that I see in downtown Canton on the highway that said, go to the Bible for answers. I would argue that the Bible has no answers to anything. It is not a book of answers, it's a book that contains questions and forces the reader to answer those questions. And often it does so by telling a story that has no closure to it, that leaves open the question of what the answer to the question in the story is. So when we think about religions as providing answers to people, or religions as telling people what to think, often this is not modeled in the Bible. The fourth one is learning through argument. Again, often people, when they are raised within a religious tradition, they are, again, told what to think, because that's the whole idea of a tradition, is you're passing on the wisdom of the past, right? And you can find that in various books of the Bible, but you can also find another model of learning, which is, again, what I call learning through argument. Learning through not being told something, but being forced to realize something. And then finally, multiple perspectives. Again, when people use the term biblical, they seem to assume that the Bible is all one thing. But actually, there are many passages in the Bible, many books even, that create point and counterpoint, that create multiple perspectives. And they're obviously arranged like that. That not just the writers, but the librarians who put them together arrange them in such a way so that it forces the reader, or at least the reader guided by whatever tradition puts this together, to contemplate complexity of human experience. It's not a simple view of what it means to be human. Right? Okay, so we're going to go through we're going to have a textual example of each of these things, and then I will invite some comment. So skepticism. Skepticism is actually a philosophy that began around the time that this book that I'm going to be referring to probably was written. This is the book that is called in the Bible, in Greek, Ecclesiastes, and in Hebrew, Koheleth. It is a philosophical treatise and an argument that life has no intrinsic meaning. It argues that life has no intrinsic meaning, and when we try to impose a meaning upon it, we will make ourselves sad. We will suffer. It's almost Buddhist in that way. Skepticism, though, itself was a philosophy that the Greeks invented. So around the 3rd century BC, maybe around the time this book was written, the skeptics were philosophers who believed that in order to live a happy life, in order to live a full, happy, joyous, fulfilled existence, one had to withhold one's opinions about things that could not be decided on the basis of empirical evidence. So it's not just that they were saying, let's be empirical about how we derive our opinions, but rather saying, when we try to find answers to questions that cannot be answered, we cause suffering to ourselves. We become unhappy. And the way to be happy is to not worry about things that we can't know about. So that is the purpose of this book, is to make that case. It is not the dominant view in the other books in this library. Most books in this library think that life has meaning, and you can sort of describe it, you can live it out. But Koheleth doesn't think so. So let's take a look just at a couple of slides from this book to illustrate the way he talks and the way he challenges the reader to think about human experience. So first of all, the author identifies himself in the persona of a wise king. He himself was not this king, but he sort of places himself in this role. He says, I, Koheleth, was king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my mind to search and investigate in wisdom all things that are done under the sun. So he wants to know everything about everything, and he's going to investigate. He's going to use sort of a kind of philosophical approach to things. His conclusion, which he reaches several times, is what he says. He says there is nothing better. So he says, what should people do in life? Well, he doesn't give some grand idea. He simply says there's nothing better than to rejoice and to do well. Moreover, he says, the fact that all can eat and drink and enjoy the good of all their toil, the fact that people can be happy simply by living, is a gift from God, he says. I recognize that whatever God does will endure forever. There is no adding to it or taking from it. Thus has God done that he may be feared. Okay, so this is basically a kind of philosophy of life where he says, eat, drink, and be merry. And that's it. So this is not like Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, where people speculate about various reasons for existence. He says, the purpose of existence is to be joyful, right? Because there's nothing better than that. There's nothing more that one can achieve. And he says, this is not an accident. It's not a cause for despair. He says, this is the way that reality is designed. For him, this comes from God. It comes from Source, right? Source has designed reality this way that he may be feared. Now, fear, this is a very common term in the Bible. It doesn't mean like being terrified in a negative sense. Sometimes it's described as reverence, but really it's humility in the presence of the sacred. And for him, the sacred is all of life, right? So this is his philosophy. He continues, he tries to explain why things are this way. He says, as for human beings, the reason why there's nothing better for us than simply to enjoy life, it's God's way of testing us and showing that we are no better than beasts. So all of humanity's aspirations and, kind of overly inflated views of ourselves, we live in a world that deflates those expectations, and that's what it's designed to do. Many ideas about the meaning of life or some ultimate purpose, often they revolve around the question of the spiritual dimension of human existence, that somehow we're born, we die, but there's something more than that. He says no. He says the lot of mortals and the lot of beasts is the same lot. One dies as well as the other. Both have the same life breath. Human beings have no advantage over beasts, but all is vanity. This is one of his favorite expressions. Vanity, by the way, that's one translation into English. Literally, the Hebrew chevel just means impermanent. Reality is impermanent, he says. Humans and animals go to the same place. We're made from dust. We return to dust. Who knows if the life breath of mortals goes upward and the life breath of beasts goes earthwards? In other words, there's no knowledge of anything beyond the life we know. And therefore, he says, there's nothing better for mortals than to rejoice in their work, for this is their lot. Who will let them see what will come after? That's a rhetorical question for him. There's no way to know that. Okay, two more things here, and then we'll talk about him. So he says, I've seen all manner of things in my impermanent days. I've seen the just perishing in their justice and the wicked living long in their wickedness. In some ways, he's reacting to a very common view among philosophers that you should learn what is good and you should try to live a good life. But he says, you shouldn't do this in the expectation that you will experience anything different, because many people who are unjust, many people who do bad things, who harm themselves and others, they seem to flourish, right? Why do the wicked flourish and the just perish? He says that's the way of things. Then he issues these two interesting rules. These are sort of fortune cookie sayings. He says, be not just to excess. Don't be overly just. Don't be overly wise, because it'll lead you to ruin. Don't be overly wicked, and don't be foolish. Why should you die before your time? So these are these two sort of proverbs he quotes. But then he says, it's good to hold on to this rule and not to let go of that one. But the one who fears God will succeed in both. When you think about this, he's talking about both of these things. He says, if you hold to this rule, that's the second one, if you are not excessively wicked or foolish, you will live well. And don't let go of the other one. Don't be too good. So often we think of religious texts as saying, be good and avoid evil. And obviously, in some sense, he agrees with that. But he says, there's a problem with people who want to be too good. And there's a problem with people who want to be too wicked. If you learn how to fear God, if you learn how to radically accept the way things are designed and be joyous about them, you will neither have to worry about being too just or too wicked. It's really an odd way of thinking. Okay, so those are some samples of how Koheleth thinks as a skeptic. He critiques these notions that there's some grand purpose for being human. But then there's this conclusion. These are the last words of this book, and they're not written by the author. If you read carefully, it's very clear that this is being written by someone other than the author. Notice that the words begin by talking about the author in the third person. Throughout the book, Koheleth talks about himself in the first person, I. But now another voice comes in, writes this conclusion, says, besides being wise, Koheleth taught the people knowledge, scrutinized and arranged many proverbs. He sought appropriate sayings. He wanted to write down true sayings. And then there's a proverb. What's the function of such sayings? It says it's to goad people. It's to get them to think. They're like fixed spikes that are collected, these sayings. And then the speaker here, who's anonymous, says, as to more than these, my son, beware. So now we have this hypothetical situation where this treatise on the meaninglessness of life is being read by a father to a son, and he says, don't pay too much attention to this, son. Don't take it too seriously. It's just there to get you to think. He says, of the making of books there is no end, and in much study there is much weariness. The last word, when all is heard, fear God and keep his commandments, for this concerns all humankind, because God will bring to judgment every work with all its hidden qualities, whether good or bad. Okay, well, this expression, fear God, we've seen that's something Koheleth talks about, but when he says, and keep God's commandments, Koheleth never talks about commandments. This is clearly a different perspective. It's almost as though, in order to get this into the Bible, someone decided they needed to say, don't take this in an absolute sense. Don't take it too seriously. You should just follow God's commandments. So on the one hand, the book gets into the Bible because it's used, I guess. People found it useful. But on the other hand, someone felt the need to say, you shouldn't pay too much attention to it. But notice that by doing this, he's not actually changing what Koheleth wrote. So this way of understanding the Bible, he's sort of acknowledging that I can't suppress what this author is writing, and I have to acknowledge there is some wisdom in it. But I'm still going to say I don't agree with it totally. And that's a book in the Bible. So here's an example. Let's maybe pause for a second. This is an example of how the Bible becomes a library of skepticism. Right? It contains viewpoints that seem to be fairly self-assured that human beings have some amazing role in the universe. And then you have this text that deflates all that. And at the end of the text, you have this conversation between the author and this later commentator who says, don't take him too seriously, but I can't get rid of him. So what kind of library is this that has maybe some dominant viewpoints about what it means to be human, about what we should do in life, but then it has this counterpoint, this other view, which seems to be very different from it? It's all in the same library. So what would we do with something like that? What does this tell us about the kind of library this is? It contains voices that don't always agree, and that even acknowledge that they don't agree. So when I was reading Koheleth to you, does any of that resonate? Do you sometimes feel that, well, life is about eating, drinking, and being merry, and that's the way it is? There's nothing more to it than that, so we should try to radically accept it, not posit these philosophical ideals that we should follow to in some extreme sense? And then you get the counterpoint. Well, don't take it too seriously, he says. I guarantee you will not hear that preached in any church. And yet it's in their Bible.
It's hard for me to separate. This is Kim, by the way. So it's hard for me to listen to this without just thinking about duality.
Yeah.
So right now you're talking, things are good and they're bad and they're right and they're wrong and they're happy and they're sad or blah, 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 whatever.
Hmm.
And I'm more on the yoga path and been studying like the philosophy of yoga and the ethics, which is a very spiritual path that steps outside of that.
Right.
You know what I mean? It says, I'm not going to attach myself to pleasure.
Right.
Doesn't mean I'm not going to have pleasure and I'm not free to experience pleasure. I'm just not going to attach to it.
Hmm.
But I'm also not going to avert from the unpleasant things in life as well.
Right. Right.
So it feels like a contradiction. I don't know, like of what they're saying. And we're looking at it through the lens of duality.
I like that. I like that term
Right.
duality. In a sense, you could say maybe
They're creating it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. But by
Right.
including this book in the library, you are creating duality, and you're saying that that's
Right.
important, right? and yeah, and because life is like that, is it not? Right?
It is. And I'm really excited about the series you have because I try to read the Bible and I do. I want to learn these ancient texts and I get too frustrated with them. So I'm hoping
Yeah.
these conversations can bring some peace inside of me because my kids are more on the Christian path right now. So I want to learn about it to be able to have conversations with them, but getting it to resonate and stepping into duality is really hard for me to do.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear you. I
It's
hear
like
you.
rare.
Does anyone else have any reactions to this? I like the idea of duality.
It was interesting. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It was interesting that, like, for instance, you had the words highlighted, fear God.
Mhm.
And when I started going through my deconstruction process of the way I've been raised and so forth, is like when they say God, what are they referring to? A lot of times it was like, okay, well, first of all, God's a man, and the men are the leaders, and so fearing God means listening to them and doing what they tell you to do.
Right.
They're not really saying to fear God. They're saying fear us,
Yeah.
and fear the retribution is going to come about if you don't follow us, and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And
So that's a good. I see what you're saying. So yeah, I mean, we don't really need to get too much into the gendering of God in the Bible, but one important dimension of Koheleth, the book that we were looking at, is that he says you basically can't know anything about God except that God will, God will somehow bring every deed to judgment. But there's no commandments in here. There's no history of God interacting with people. He says God's far away. So
right.
God has created a world in which we can enjoy, in which we can have joy and success and all that. But he says there's nothing to be gained. He says you can't acquire and grasp hold of things. So this is a God for him who is very different from the God of maybe the person who's writing those last lines, who talk about commandments and things like that. So I mean, yeah, God is still gendered as male. That's not.
Well, I mean, the three Western religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, are all patriarchal. So and when you see, like, in the worship, generally it's not the women that are giving a leading role. They want to make them subservient and so forth. So and to me, none of this has to do with God per se.
Mm-hmm.
I think ultimately it's beyond gender. Yeah, but what I'm saying is how it's applied to people as a result. Also, too, it's kind of like there's a difference between what you're told about God by other people as to what you should believe and what really is God. And to me, there's a big difference. So it's interesting too that he's saying that, oh, we're just beasts. Well, I can understand maybe certain people back then are farmers, maybe they're sheep herders or something like that. They live very close to the earth, but in our modern day and age, we can have a job that we don't have to toil in the soil, so to speak,
Right.
and we can think about things deeply. I also think that, like, there's a difference between, like, having a priesthood. Yeah, I think there's importance in having the education, like what you're presenting with us here, as opposed to, say, just me reading it on my own and coming to my own understanding of it. there's a big difference between the two.
Yeah. When you were saying about there's a difference between being told what to think or having thoughts about God and experiencing God. That's a great segue to the next example, which is
okay, great.
That. So let's do that. Okay.
Sure.
We probably won't be able to do this for everyone. So let's keep going here. Okay. So next example of an inconvenient text. Subversion. So this is a visit to the book of Job. It's one of the other oddball texts in the library that consciously seeks to challenge, while still be incorporated within this library, some of the main premises of it. But it's not a simple subversion. So most people have heard of the character of Job, but very rarely do people read the whole book because it's actually very tedious to read. It's people talking in poetic stanzas for 39 chapters and talking past each other constantly. But I'm going to pull a couple of points here. Okay, so the story of Job is a good guy who bad things happen to him, right? He's suffering, and his three friends come to commiserate with him and try to comfort him. But their attempts to comfort him revolve around religious explanations for suffering, none of which apply to him, but they insist that they must. In other words, this is like there are three assumptions that these friends have. First of all, that if something bad happens to you, it's because you've done something bad. The second assumption is that God would never abandon the innocent, would never let the innocent suffer, nor would he help the wicked. And that obviously ties into the first one there. So if you're suffering, you must not be innocent. And thirdly, that God can reveal the justice of his ways, that the inherent justice of the universe can be understood by human beings. These are the things that Job's friends kind of beat him with for 29 chapters of discourse, and saying, you really should accept your suffering because you've obviously done something wrong, but God hasn't killed you. So obviously he wants you to repent. It's like, well, I haven't done anything, says Job. I know I haven't done anything. He says, that's deflection. You're really just trying to delude yourself. You surely cannot understand what's going on to you because you don't understand the nature of divine justice. So these are basically religious voices, attacking this guy for saying that he doesn't believe in these things. At the end of the dialogue, with the monologue, that the friends go away for a moment, finally Job explodes and verbally attacks God and saying, this is not good. You can't let this happen to me. I know I'm a good person, and these people who've been talking to me are all wrong. And so he says, I demand that you show me what's going on. I demand you explain to me why I'm suffering. And it's really interesting that in the history of interpretation, almost every interpretation, people want the book of Job to be an explanation for suffering, but it's exactly the opposite. God says, who is this who darkens counsel with these words of ignorance? He's talking to Job now. He says, gird up your loins now like a man, and I will question you, and you will tell me the answers. So he says, you want to understand the world? Answer these questions first. And then he goes into this long list of questions about the nature of reality. But it begins basically with this premise: where were you when I founded the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. The basic idea here is that God, in this story, God understands why things are happening, but he can't explain it to people because he says, you would have to have my viewpoint. You would have to know what I know. You would have to be God to understand why things happen. I can't tell you why things are happening. You would have to be me to understand what I said. It would be like talking in hieroglyphics to you and you wouldn't understand the language. So here's the interesting part about what happens. After he lambasts Job for about 2 chapters, Job responds, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be hindered. I have spoken, but I did not understand. Things too marvelous for me which I did not know. So he's sort of acknowledging with humility that he can't understand everything. But to your point, Ron, notice what he says. By hearsay, I had heard of you up until now, right? I've heard these beliefs about you that people are telling me, but now my eye has seen you. So hearing versus seeing is here the distinction between ideas and experience, right? He says, I have experienced, God shows up in this big sort of, numinous thundercloud and all this. And therefore, he says, I disown what I have said and repent in dust and ashes. So he acknowledges that he cannot know why things happen, even though he knows his friends are wrong about him. How does God react to this? In the story, he says to the friends who have been trying to defend him the whole time, he says, my anger blazes against you. You have not spoken rightly concerning me, as has my servant Job. Well, again, what were they saying? They say God never lets the innocent suffer. He never lets the wicked flourish. And we can understand why God does things. He says, you have not spoken rightly, but my servant Job has, after he just told Job that he can't know. And so he says, you better apologize to him, because you are not representing me. You're trying to lie for me, basically. And so you have this interesting story in which the one who is, in a sense, truly right is not right because of his ideas, but because of his seeing. He sees God and he understands things that the limitations of human understanding. Whereas the friends who claim to know what God is like and who have beliefs about him are told by God, you're all wrong. And that's the book of Job. That's an example of assumptions about God and about human experience that are directly subverted by God as a character in the narrative, right? But what did Job get that was right, and what did the friends get that was wrong? It's not explained, and so that forces the reader to say, okay, well, we have to go back. What were they wrong about? What was Job right about? And so on. Okay, so that's a second way in which the Bible can be inconvenient. Any thoughts on that? So again, the difference between ideas and experience. With God agreeing.
I kind of feel like it's a prime example of, there's no way for us to know what's in the afterlife, what exists after this. And we can make assumptions all day, but we have to be careful being judgmental of other people and how they live their life right, in accordance to their own path.
Yeah. I mean, this is very much a text critiquing judgmentalism by human beings.
Right.
When God takes the side of the person who is being judged, even though he says you also don't know what's going on. But yeah, it has something to do about experience, humility, and the idea that people who claim to speak for God are actually not speaking for God.
Right.
And this is in the Bible. And again, and the dominant view of the Bible. And it's not like this. Then people who read this say, okay, well, the other 55 books in the Bible are all wrong about this, but rather, again, there's this duality, right? Like Kim was saying, there's a duality between assertions that are affirmed and qualifications. Well, we can't really know, so we have to have humility when we affirm these things.
Right. So, and even though it may be with the best intent, even though it may be with the best intentions, trying to aid somebody or help them, it may be serving the alternate end, which you kind of got to just check yourself.
Yeah, that people often, even if one believes what one is saying, one may be asserting it in a way that is destructive to someone else, including and delusional to oneself.
Right.
Okay, next one.
Can I say something?
Oh, go ahead, yeah. Go ahead.
So part of the process I went through early on, and I guess part of what woke me up to maybe reject the way that I was raised to a degree. Not, I think that studying the Bible was vital, and that was like a good basis to start from, but that wasn't the end of the path. So when I started to learn logic, then you would take like a statement and you would analyze it. And so the person would express it as though it were a truth. Okay. And is partly, were they just saying that and there is no evidence to support it, or the evidence is very weak and so forth. So it's in many cases, there's like an assertion made, like, for instance, one cannot know. So that is a belief that you have, but that doesn't mean that that's true. So I guess I'll stop there and you can comment on it if you want.
I don't know if I can comment on it, but yeah, I mean that's the kind of thing that's going on in this text. The text is trying to dramatize this. How do we know what we know, and how do we use what we think we know to target other people, right? And where God is taking the side of the person who is at the receiving end of that kind of delusional discourse. So
I think one difference too that you see there in Job is that he became humble as a result.
yes,
And I think that's very important. So a lot of times what you'll see in religion is this kind of braggadocio, that I know and therefore I have the right to do this because I'm on the side of God, and therefore that gives me the right to do what I'm doing. There's no humility in that. I don't
which
think.
would and that might help explain what the function of a text like this might be. That then there are other texts in the Bible that are very affirmative about certain things, and that's where religious people get these affirmations. But if you include Job, you have to say also have to have that humility, right? Whenever you're going to articulate one's convictions and so forth. So again, the function of the library is to preserve that duality, to avoid people taking extremes, right? Or being too sure about themselves, perhaps. Okay, so the third example of an inconvenience is, well, a nice thing is what I called open-ended questions. So Job is actually an example of questions that are basically silenced. It's like you can't know them, so just don't ask them. But there's another tendency in some biblical texts where there's a question that is raised and not resolved, even by God, and the person who raises the question is not silenced. The person who raises the question is not condemned for asking it or for pushing back against God. Often, again, we think, okay, God says it, we have to listen to it. We can't question that, right? This is the book of Jonah, and many people know this. Maybe, again, if you've been raised within a religion, you may know this as the tale of Jonah and the whale. And that's usually what kids learn, and it's not the main point of the book. So the story of Jonah is about a prophet who is asked to do something he doesn't want to do. And the real purpose of the book is, after having done it anyway, he wants to die. Let's look at the context here. So the context is he has been being asked by God to go to the center of the Assyrian Empire, the big bad empire in the world that's brutalized his people, and he's going there to ask them to repent of their ways. Now you might think that, okay, well, he says, I know they're not going to do it, but the whole paradox of the text is that the evil empire suddenly becomes humble, and he's upset because he didn't get to see them destroyed for their wickedness. So he says to the people of the Assyrian Empire, if you don't change your ways, God's going to destroy you. And immediately they all say, it says they believed in God and they all proclaimed a fast and put on sackcloth. That means they're sort of in a state of, we did wrong, we're going to repent. And it gets really funny because we're told that by the decree of the king, no man or beast, cattle or sheep shall taste anything. They shall not eat, they shall not drink water. So they're all going to fast, even the animals. And if you think that the Bible's not funny, this is meant to be satirical. It says, man and beast alike must be covered with sackcloth and call loudly to God, and must turn from their evil way and from the violence of their hands. So it's applying human categories of morality even to animals, to the poor cows. Okay, you should repent of your evil deeds. So it's hilarious, really. But that's just a backstory. So what really is the source of this open-ended question is Jonah's reaction to it. He says, okay, well, I didn't want to go here in the first place because, he says, I knew that you, God, who told me to do this, are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger, abounding in kindness, repenting of punishment, and you've allowed the evil empire to be forgiven. So now, Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. Okay, so he's really upset, right? He would rather die in a universe where the big bad empire survives because they repented. And then we have the question, God asks, are you right to be angry? And there's no answer initially. Notice God doesn't say, you were wrong to think that. He just says, are you right to be angry? Then he sits outside the city, hoping maybe that it'll still be destroyed by a divine fireball. And while he's watching, we're told that God causes a plant to grow that gives sort of shade for his head. And we're told that Jonah was greatly delighted by the plant because it kept him shaded while he was watching for the city to be destroyed. But the next morning at dawn, God provided a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. And when the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and Jonah was upset, right? So he experiences pleasure and then displeasure. Again, he says, it is better for me to die than to live. And then God continues to converse with him. Do you have a right to be angry over this plant that was sheltering you and now is gone? He says, yes, I have a right to be angry, enough to die. And then God, again, engages him in conversation. You're concerned over this plant, which cost you no effort and which you did not grow. It came up one night and perished the next. And this is a form of argumentation in Hebrew called kal vachomer. If it's true for the less, then it's true for the greater. So if you shouldn't be upset by this plant that grew up and died, shouldn't I, God, be concerned over this great city in which there are more than 220,000 people in it who would otherwise be destroyed if I didn't ask them to repent? Not to mention all the animals. That's the punchline. That's the end of the story. It doesn't end with Jonah saying, "Oh, you were right, oh God." He's not like Job, where he says, "Oh, you're right. I had wrong ideas, and now I'm gonna repent and be humble." No, the story ends there. It doesn't have some epitaph saying, "And Jonah was wrong to be angry." It doesn't moralize at all. Again, many people think of the Bible simply as a library of moralizing texts. But here's a text that doesn't moralize and doesn't condemn the person for objecting or being angry. This was once commented on by a Korean theologian who said, Koreans sympathize with Job because if we are asked to forgive the Japanese and the way they have brutalized our people, we can understand why Job would be upset, why Jonah would be angry. So he says this text is important because it acknowledges the importance of anger. Not just for the psychological well-being of the person, but anger is something that expresses when something is wrong with the world, right? Even in the Christian tradition, Thomas Aquinas says anger is a virtue, and if you don't have enough of it, that's problematic. If you have too much, that's problem too. It's sort of the middle way idea. But again, this is a text in which there's no morality play about how the person was wrong and God was right. God leaves that open. Maybe he was right. He doesn't tell him what to think. And so when we think of religious texts as simply postulating some simple solution to things, here's one that chooses not to, and is also pretty funny when you think about it. So when we think about what the function of a text like this might be, God is presented in the book of Job as knowing everything and not being able to communicate it to humans. Well, here, God just asked the question, do you have a right to be angry? And Jonah says, yes, I do. And God does not contradict him. What do we make of that kind of ending? What does that tell us about maybe the way in which people think about God, even think about source, or think about the way things work in the world, or even about anger? Again, anger is a pretty important emotion for humans, not just as something that leads us astray, but also something that we might need.
I feel like a lot of us as humans, we carry a lot of confirmation bias where we want to be right.
Right.
And this is an example that you have to just acknowledge that you're not always going to be right. As a matter of fact, you probably have a gross misunderstanding because you truly don't have the whole story available to you. It's just not something that our human bodies can comprehend.
And in this particular case, Jonah's not just any person, he's also a prophet. So his job is to speak on God's behalf. But so he says, I'll do it, but I'm not going to like it. I'm not going to agree with it. So there's even this sense of fulfilling one's duty within the world and yet still being able to express, the emotional toll that takes on one.
Right.
There's other prophets in the Bible like Jeremiah who talk about how, being a prophet, doing the job is actually terribly destructive to themselves. And the fact that you have texts that illustrate how being a certain way, having this, what he calls a fire in his bones, he has to speak out against this injustice, even though it's going to hurt him. It's something internal, and it's something that is also, he's called to do, but still, there's this great attention in texts like this to the human toll that being human takes in these cases. And, God gives him a space. You can be angry. I'm not going to tell you what to think or what to feel, as long as you did your job.
Right.
I completely agree with that, Chris. Like
Amen.
that's what I was going to talk about. I was like, we're not gods, we're human.
Right.
Like we have human emotion, and learning to use that anger in a just way is our
Right.
work as humans.
And
You know what
then
I mean?
Yeah, and in
It's
order
not about
to
the anger, it's about what we do with it.
Yeah, and part of being able to do that, we can't use it unless we acknowledge it, right? We can't use it
Correct.
because we acknowledge this is real. I understand where it's coming from, and now I have to decide what to do with it. Right.
Mhm. And that's the thing. I think that there's training in that. You know what I mean? We don't automatically just learn what to do with anger, and our culture wants us to suppress it. So,
Yeah.
it tells us that it's a bad emotion and it's a negative emotion, but really it's not. So I think
To
a
add
lot
on to
of
that
us,
point,
I know for me personally, like I don't have a lot of capacity for anger. My anger will come up and it will quickly turn into despair.
Mm.
Or anger will come up, and maybe I'll lash out. So my job as a human being is to learn how to feel that anger and set a boundary around it, or do what I need to do to right a wrong,
Right.
rather than be reactive to it.
Yeah, and as you said, there are two negative ways of reacting. You can turn it on yourself, and you can turn it on others.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to find what is the proper use of it.
Mm-hmm.
and that's
Which
where
I think
I
is a
feel like
skill that we learn. It's not something we just know how to do as human
Yeah.
beings.
Casey, yeah.
I was just going to say that's where I feel like the Bible, that is one advantage to the Bible. I feel like it does give an excellent earthly guide to how to handle those situations too. It's there are some contradictions within the Bible. There are some questionable, I guess, guidance, but at the end of the day, I think it does give those people who are seeking guidance something that that gives them good direction, some good moral direction to follow, and puts it into a perspective that most people can understand.
Or at least that it can, stories like this can model the importance of expressing and then thinking about what you're going to do with that emotion, right? Even if they don't tell you what to do with it, it models it, right? And again, like you were saying, Kim, too, we have a culture that says, no, you either suppress it or you attack someone else. And so there's not a lot of good models about how to deal with all the terrible stuff that's going on right now,
I do know.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I have a thought. So since we are largely a product of the environment that we are in, grew up in, what we're exposed to, so forth, a lot of people probably don't have exposure to like the Bible. And I feel like that what we're doing here is we're going within, we're analyzing it and so forth. But if you're not exposed to these things, you're never going to go through that process. So I feel like our modern society, some people may read the Bible, or maybe they listen to a certain news program or something like that, and those they're on the internet, they have their cell phone and so forth. These are the things that are creating the impressions upon them, and it's partly about who they are, who they become, and so forth.
Yeah.
So how do we get people to reflect upon these things, to go within?
Yeah.
Because to me, the spiritual journey is really about going within
Mhm.
and looking for those answers, pondering these things, not just reacting per se.
Yeah, well, and the challenge is that it requires work. It's difficult, right? It
Correct.
requires effort.
Correct.
There was I think it was an op-ed in the Atlantic a couple weeks ago by a literature professor who said the problem with AI, is that it makes everything. It appears to make everything easy, but he says what the worst thing is it removes the idea that difficulty is a good thing. That difficult
Yeah.
effort is something that you should pursue.
Mhm.
And obviously, the larger context for this too is that, religious or not, our civilization has been shaped by these texts. Knowing what they are, knowing the fullness of what they are, not just how people selectively cherry pick them to use and abuse them,
Right.
is an important counterpoint. Especially, these days where I think, the Bible is becoming more weaponized. It's important to take this library itself and say there's more in here than you think, and there's more and there's more in here than you know, and you're using it in a way that is probably counter to the very intention of a lot of this stuff. So, but anyway.
See that also means like they're taking the time to do it. What's the
Yes.
quote where he said like a lie gets all the way around the world before the truth gets its shoes on, something like that. And so people who misuse things, they want to move very quickly, so they'll put in a lie into the ether, and that lie is spread.
Yeah.
But the truth takes more time.
Yeah, and interestingly, when you get into the wisdom literature of the Bible, the most attended problem that it draws attention to is the problem of what it's called the tongue, the abuse of the abuse of language, and how powerful language is. But anyway, so let's move on. We got time for these last two here. So after, let's say goodbye to the cow, and learning through argument. Okay, so again, if you've grown up within a religious tradition, you've probably been catechized. You've been, sort of formed with, here are the things you should believe. Here's how you should believe them. And you can find some of that in the Bible, but the most important models of learning, they're not all that numerous, but they are located at very important points in the overall narrative of this library. I call it learning through argument. And so this is from Genesis chapter 18. This is part of the story of Abraham. And if you know the story of Abraham, it's, God shows up to him and says, hey, I want to do some things for you so that you become a blessing to others. Not that I'll give you stuff. I'm going to make you become a blessing to others. And the story of Abraham involves trying to determine what that means. What does it mean to be a blessing to others? What qualities does Abraham have to develop in order to be that, to become that person? And probably the most important turning point, the one that not a lot of people read, is this episode where God has lunch with Abraham. He shows up at his doorstep and says, hey, let's have lunch. And they have lunch together. It's not clear whether Abraham knows it's God or not. But God has two minions with him, two angels with him. He says, I need to send these guys down to that city Sodom because I've heard there's bad things going there and I need to find out whether it's true or not because I'm probably going to have to destroy it. But before he does this, he has God has an inner monologue. You said, Ron, that it's about the spiritual journey is sort of being inward. Here, the text actually says what God is thinking to himself. And it's really interesting what he thinks. So God is the young fellow in the painting there. It says, the Lord considered, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, now that he is to become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him? Yeah, I think I will. Because I've singled him out so that, this is the purpose, so that he may direct his children and his household in the future to keep the way of the Lord, my way, by doing what is right and just. Okay, so this is, the lesson is about knowing what is right and just, right? What is justice? What does it mean to be right? So that I may put into effect for Abraham the promises I made about him. God talks about himself in the third person here. I highlight the "so that" because it's pretty profound when you think about it. So God says at the beginning of the Abraham story, "I'll make you a blessing to others." Okay, what does that mean? He's going to wave his divine wand over Abraham and suddenly Abraham is going to be a blessing? No. Here, God is saying, unless Abraham comes to learn what is right and just, unless I somehow provoke him to learn this, I, God, cannot fulfill my promises to make him a blessing. God is all powerful in the Bible, but he's not a magician. He can't make people a certain way. He has to invite them to become a certain type of person. And here, he says, I'm about to pass judgment on this, violent city, but if I just nuke it from the sky, like I'm probably going to do, and he doesn't know why that's happening, Abraham, will not be able to know what is right and just. Now, you might think, okay, well, all God needs to do is say, okay, Abraham, I'm going to teach you about rightness and justice. I'm going to destroy this city, and here's why I'm doing it, because justice means X, Y, and Z. He doesn't do that. This is something that Abraham has to learn through argument with God. So God provokes an argument with him. So he says, yeah, these cities are so violent. I have to go down and find out whether this is true or not before I do anything about it. And then Abraham says, will you really sweep away the innocent with the guilty? So what would we, just the way that the conversation starts, the way the provocation is issued and the way Abraham responds, what is being told to us about what righteousness and justice are? I've heard that they're really bad. I have to go find out first. What does that tell us about justice? I've heard they're bad and maybe they need to be destroyed, but I have to find out whether those rumors are true. Whereas justice means hearsay is not enough, right? I'm not going to go on what social media tells me. I have to actually find out. So Abraham, though, is assuming that things are going to go bad. He says, will you really sweep away the innocent with the guilty? Okay, so now we learn that justice means that you cannot kill the innocent in order to kill the guilty. You would think we would have learned that 3,000 years later, but we're doing this all over the world right now. We're killing the innocent in order to punish the guilty, are we not? So, but notice how God has provoked Abraham to say this, and then they get into a bargaining match. And so on the left-hand side, you have Abraham posing questions and challenging God, and then God responding on the left. And it goes where he's saying, will you really sweep away the innocent with the guilty? Suppose there are 50 innocent people in the city. Would you really sweep away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 innocent people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the innocent with the guilty so that the innocent and the guilty are treated alike. Far be it from you. Should not the judge of all the world do what is just? So notice it's not God doesn't say, I am the judge of the world and I am just, and here's what I'm going to do. It's Abraham who is saying this. He's the one who's internalizing this idea of justice. And God says, yeah, if there's 50 innocent people, I'll spare the rest. Notice, too, that the concept of justice here is, if there are 50 innocent people, will you airlift them out before you nuke the place? No. If there are 50 innocent people, will you spare the whole place? He says, yeah, I will. And then they kind of go on. They bartered it down to 10 people. And there are other pieces here, too. Abraham says, look, I am but dust and ashes, but I am asking you, God, to do this. So he's kind of posturing himself, who am I to ask you, but I'm still asking you. In the Bible, one of the most important aspects of justice is interceding for others out of mercy so that the innocent do not die with the guilty. And God is training him to think this way, not, and really it says, okay, I won't destroy it if it's this many or this many. He's not just saying, Abraham, this is how you should be. He's forcing Abraham to develop this characteristic on his own. Now, in the end, of course, there are less than 10 innocent people, and so the city gets nuked, but he does airlift the innocents there. So it's kind of it's an odd story, but when you look at it, it actually has this understanding of learning, right? A learning that it's not just a list of things you should do. You actually have to hash this out, at least in conversation, if not in actual experience, in order to become a blessing to others. And there are other examples of this in the Bible too, where it's through these experiences and through these arguments that people make that they develop the characteristics they need to develop. And again, how different is that from a worldview in which it's just, here's a list of things to do? The Bible is about formation, about the formation of character, and at least, again, it models the formation of certain types of characteristics, but it does so not in a simple way of saying, this is what justice is. It forces you to argue about it, and it's through the argumentation that you learn. This is actually a model in several religious traditions. In Vajrayana Buddhism, right? If Tibetan Buddhism, you have this kind of combative dialogue method that you use for the monks to learn, to get insight. Same thing in Judaism. If you go to a yeshiva, a religious school, they're arguing with each other constantly over texts. And the idea of the argument is not to defeat the other person, but to together, through this combat, as it were, to come into a better understanding of things. Even, Socrates did the same thing, having these long arguments with people and trying to tease out what's really going on there. So you have this theme of wisdom in a lot of traditions, including here, where education means formation through, if not argument, at least some sort of, we need to find the truth together on this.
Can I add to that's to me been part of my process is to argue with myself.
Yes.
So it's all really about creating a mirror and having it reflect back to you, and you as a result of that, you come to a higher understanding, a higher place, I think.
Yep. Okay, we have time for the last one too. We're right on time. Good. Last one. Multiple perspectives. That's my theme for the last one here. Okay, so multiple perspectives. As I said, there's many places in the Bible where there are multiple versions of the same story, not least in the view of reality itself. The entire collection, the entire library begins with two creation stories, two views of what it means to be human within the cosmos. And these stories are placed right next to each other. One does not happen later than the other, sequentially. They are two different views of who we are, the nature of the cosmos, the nature of God. And the text gives us no guidance as to how to relate them to each other. Now, that's what religious traditions do. They provide a framework for interpreting these multiple perspectives. But again, the nature of this text is that it forces us, the reader or the hearer, to contemplate how do we bring these, again, it's a duality, like Kim said. So you're probably familiar with the two creation stories. Maybe you're not familiar that they are two creation stories. But this is the slide I always use for my students. In Genesis 1:11, God creates vegetation, but in Genesis 2:5, no vegetation exists. In Genesis 1:26, God creates humans, but in Genesis 2:6, no humans exist. In the first creation story, animals are created before humans, and in the second story, they're created after humans. Most importantly, for the question of who we are, in the first creation story, we are created godlike. We are like God by nature. In the second creation story, we become godlike through what we do. So there are these distinctions, narrative distinctions that sort of separate these stories, but they're right there in the beginning. So the whole library begins with this kind of duality to it. Now, if you're familiar with the texts, here's the description of human nature in the first creation story. This idea that human beings are created in God's image, whatever that means. But you have this weird threefold poetic stanza for describing it. It seems like you could have said this in one line, but he says it in 3 lines here. And when you look at the relationship of these lines, it kind of raises some interesting questions. So God created the human in his image, but who is the his referring to? The word for human in the Bible, in Hebrew, is a grammatically masculine noun. God is a grammatically masculine noun. So when it says God created the human in his image, if all you had was that, well, whose image are you talking about? The pronoun could refer to either of them. In other words, it could be either that God made human beings in God's own image, or God created a human image. Think of like a human mold, right? This is humans will have this structure to them, and I created the mold, then I'm going to pour the essence of humanity into that mold. Either of those is conceivable based on that one line, but in the next line it says, no, it's in the image of God. He created it, the human. And then why do you have this third one about male and female? Well, I guess it means males are no more godlike than females and vice versa, or perhaps male and female is understood to be a kind of duality, the primordial duality of human existence from which all other differences come, and that somehow it is the complementarity of these differences between one person and another that images God too. So in other words, the image of God could be saying something about a human person in isolation, or it could be saying something about our interpersonal nature. But these are questions that are raised just by the grammar, and the text doesn't tell us what to say. And then in the other story, you have a very different understanding of human nature, where it says that we are formed out of the dust of the ground. We're not godlike in this one. God blows breath into our nostrils, but God does that for ants and gerbils as well. So that's just talking about human beings as animals. But this notion of formation, this is a different verb. In the first creation story, create, bara, is a verb that only refers to something that God does. And in the second story, to form is a process, right? Creation is like that. Formation is a process. And in the second story, of course, the human beings become like God, or they become divine by gaining knowledge of good and evil, which is to say the capacity to know right from wrong, the moral discernment, something like that. And then in that story, God says, what if they also reach out and become immortal? So here you even have a definition of what it means to be God. It means to know good and evil and to be immortal. So human beings are sort of like God because they gain this knowledge, but they're not like God because they don't live forever. And apparently God wants to keep it that way in this story. But again, these are two different views of human nature. In one way to observe this duality, in the first creation story, all that defines the human person is sort of instantaneous. We're created this way. In the second story, we become this through a process of formation. And when we talk about duality, we could think of human beings both ways, right? I mean, what is light? Is it a particle or wave? The answer is yes, right? We could describe light in both of these ways. We could also describe being human both as a kind of static set of characteristics, which would be true, but also as something that is the end of a process or the result of a process. The Bible begins with both of these, right? And it acknowledges that duality. So those are some of the ways. Those are my 5 examples of how the Bible resists any kind of oversimplification of our experience as human beings. It critiques one-sided views of things or inadequate understandings of things, and it is structured that way. Even with the relationship of different viewpoints are structured in order to create that duality or that that dialogue. Because then you have to ask, well, let's see, how do these two things relate? Well, maybe you have to have a conversation about that. Maybe you have to reflect on our own experiences. It's designed to do that. But how often do people use it for that? Not always, because it's hard. It takes effort. And again, that's going to be kind of the focus of this series that I'll be doing starting next month, is looking carefully and drawing out these interesting pieces from each part of the Bible and seeing what we come up with. So any further thoughts?
How do you feel that translation plays a part from the original text? And I know there's been some discussions about that too, as to what is the original. text, be it Hebrew, Greek. So
Mhm.
how do you feel like that plays into some of these stories?
It's a factor. I would say that usually translation can help more precisely understand what the issue is, but it can't actually resolve. I mean, you could have bad translations and still recognize the things that we recognize today. But one has to begin that with the fact that there is no original.
Yep.
We no longer have access to an original. The earliest physical manuscripts we have are third century BC Dead Sea Scrolls, and even those are copies of copies of copies of copies. Now, some of the later texts in the Bible were written at later times, and there may be the tradition may be closer to those texts. But I think it's a fallacy that if we could actually know the precise consonants and letters, somehow that would make it easy for us. It might again give more precision to it, but it wouldn't actually make the dynamic, what the texts are doing, any less challenging, I would think. But yeah, I mean, there are certainly places where the Greek will have something quite different than the Hebrew, and vice versa. But yeah, that's kind of a secondary or even tertiary type of question. The great thing about it is that we live in a literate society. You can go buy a copy. You can access this for free online. We have the ability as individuals or in community to read these texts and more or less perceive what's going on in them as terms of how it's challenging us to think. So yeah, translation. I mean, I'm totally into translation. I do that all the time. But even translation is interpretation, right?
Right.
How you choose to translate something is interpretive, and it's less so in Hebrew. Hebrew has structure to it, but when you get into Greek, there's no word order, and so how you position the subject and the object and the verb is part of the message about how you emphasize and communicate something. And English translations don't really capture that unless you start talking like Yoda, right? Yeah, so that's fun. I mean, we'll definitely be able to look at a granular level at some of these things when I do this series. But yeah, it'll basically be trying to provide that information, but really keeping that discussion at the level of what's the challenge, what's it trying to get us to, how is it trying to get us to think, and is this helpful or not? I think there's a lot that's really cool there, and a lot of it is ignored by religions just because religions are institutions. That they have goals, and they're not necessarily at odds with the text, but the emphasis may be different. And just like with any human institution, you can't force people to go on a spiritual journey. You can't force them to turn inward. You can only give them the tools to do it, right?
Yep.
Anything else?
I think it's strange or interesting that, like, my own journey, it was like more, it kind of like a pearl, like you have the agitation, which creates the pearl, but you need that agitation to get there. Strange paradox, I think.
Yeah, and so we saw that in that second to last example. God says, I need to agitate Abraham if he's going to learn this.
Correct.
Or there's a great story I've just been using Old Testament examples, but there's a great story in the Gospels where this woman comes to Jesus and changes his mind about something. She says, he runs into this non-Jewish woman, and he's trying to get a break from all his healing ministry, and she says, my daughter is possessed by a demon, please free her. And he says, sorry lady, you're not an Israelite, you're not part of my job. And she says, but even the dogs under the table eat the scraps. And he says, you're right, because of this argument I will do that. And so so here's where it's Jesus being challenged by someone that leads him to understand his own expansion of his mission. He didn't get a divine message from them, or maybe God was speaking through her. Who knows? But yeah, there's plenty of interesting scenes like that where, again, it models something we know to be true about ourselves, right? Something we know that at least is a possibility of how we be human. So yeah, there's a lot of really great stuff in there that, that's always my mantra. The Bible's a book of questions, not of answers, and it's far cooler than religious people make it out to be. And most of it's not about religion. Okay, any other thoughts? So we're just about at time right now. Okay, well, thank you for pivoting on a dime to our remote format today. I'm pretty sure that we will have access to face-to-face interaction very soon. Definitely hoping for that by the beginning of February when we start this series. But we'll definitely keep you posted by our, Bo will send out email blasts and so forth.
I would also note that keep an eye on the YouTube channel. We're going to try to stream it as well. And also our Facebook page, we'll get that back up and going, and the other sources for connecting with us.
Great. Okay, take care,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
See you later.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.